We're going to talk about history today, and the chronology you're going to get is the chronology of the Knights of Christ. As you know, those familiar with the Dighton Rock Museum, you already know about the history of the Portuguese Knights of Christ, some of you. And if you don't, we're going to talk about it today. The late Dr. Silva and the Friends of Dighton Rock obviously were responsible for this great museum. Dr. Silva was obviously a love Portuguese. He loved the history. He loved everything about it. I do too. My father in the Templar world is Grand Prior Luis Matos, Luis-Matos, out of Portugal, out of Tomar, and he is fabulous. My trip to Tomar, besides a lapel pin, I learned a lot of history, and he took me to all of the places in Portugal where history was made. And so this obviously created my interest in the Templars and what started me along the path. And so that's what we'll discuss today. And if you've been to Portugal, how many of you guys have been to Portugal before? Fabulous. Oh, that's fabulous. Okay, so you guys are very familiar with the Convent of Christ. You've been to Tomar, you've seen Almiro Castle, you've seen all of the sites. That is fabulous. Great. Awesome. And those of you that have been there, you're probably familiar with Dr. Silva's writings. Is everybody familiar with Dr. Silva's writings that when he wrote about the rock and everything? So let's assume today, we know there's several theories of the rock's creation. We're going to bypass that, and we recognize that everybody's open to interpreting the rock they want, and that's great. Today we're just going to assume that Dr. Silva's theories are correct, and we'll just go from there and talk about that aspect of it. And so that's what we'll use. Once you receive your chronology from John, we'll start in on the Knights of Christ and their ancestry with the Knights Templar. But before that, let me start you off with the Knights Templar, because they were the originators of the Knights of Christ. It's an incredible history. You're familiar with the Crusades. Everybody's heard of the Crusades and read about them. Pope Urban II called for the first crusade, and it was successful beyond their belief. They took Jerusalem. It wasn't totally expected that they would have that much success, but they did catch the current residents off guard, and they were able to take Jerusalem on that first crusade. But now they had to hold it. And the pilgrims still were traveling down the road to Jerusalem to visit Jerusalem, and they were having problems. So, as you know, it's a long path from Europe to Jerusalem, and so they were getting robbed, they were getting killed, things like this. They were easy pickings. So what happened? A band of originally 9 knights, is the famous story, got together to protect the road. Now, how much of a road can 9 knights protect? Probably not that much, but that is the originating start of them, and they obviously grew from there. Each knight would have had probably 3 people that would have helped them. Carry the shield, carry the sword, all of these different things, a bowman, a pikeman possibly. So each knight did have an extra couple people, and that did create a larger group than just 9. But it did start out small. The significance of 9 in numerology is that it's a number of strength, and it's we believe that the 9 knights originally was to present that strength, that number symbology. So was it 9? It may have been. But we move on from there. The knights came together. For the first 11 years, they weren't recognized by the Catholic Church. They were on their own, the Knights Templar. And what happened after this is they needed more resources, they needed more money, they needed more knights. So what they had is a champion in Bernard de Clairvaux from southern France. He was a Cistercian. At that point, he was a Cistercian archbishop because he was sent to start his own Cistercian abbey, and he was quite close to the Pope. He had the Pope's ear. He was powerful. He was called the father of the Templars because Bernard de Clairvaux, and how many of you guys are from right here in town? You know the Catholic Church named Bernard? Okay, that's the significance behind that Catholic Church. And when I first found out about it, I was shocked because I was like, not only is it tied into the Knights of Christ and the Knights Templar, but the church is named after Bernard de Clairvaux, the father of the Templars. I went to the priest and I said, do you realize the history? And you guys even named your church after the father of the Templars. And he was quite shocked himself. He wasn't aware of all of the history. So I took a lot of pictures and I was quite amazed that. So anyways, right here in town, closest church to this museum is the Bernard de Clairvaux Catholic Church. So we move on. Now, in 1129, Bernard de Clairvaux, the Council of Troyes, he talks about to the Pope and to the group and to the council that met the need for more money and for more knights. The Pope hears them, grants them their wish, and officially recognizes the Knights Templar as his army. They will only answer to the Pope. They would be not answering to any king, not under any principality. They would just answer the Pope himself. They're created. Now they have official recognition. The donations pour in. The Pope encourages people to give. They receive land. Fast forward, we go 50 years later. Now the Knights are in almost every European country. They're almost in each. They have land given to them in almost every part of Europe. And it's an incredible explosion. Do you need some more?
Yeah, there's half the crowd doesn't have them.
Okay, all right. So I am very excited that there's so many here. And I want to apologize to you. If you email me on that email on the card, is there enough cards to go around? Not enough cards. All right, here's what. I've got more cards. Yes? Yep.
Anyone that has a cell phone could take a picture and they can follow along on their cell phone.
Right.
Very good idea.
Right, very good.
And if you can
Yep.
use your outdoor voice,
Is it a little bit quiet? I apologize. Okay.
thought we had a mic, but we couldn't get it to work.
Okay, I'm going to talk louder. I'm sorry for anyone in the back. Okay, I'm going to talk louder.
Does anybody want a card to contact us? I've only
Yeah.
got a few.
Yeah.
Sorry.
What we can do. So we move on 50 years from the time when they were recognized in the Council of Troy. Now we have the Knights established. What do? They become, because they have land and farms, and because they're cultivating, the ones that are put in different countries, England and France, become farmers and tend cows and do every sort of business you can imagine. So what is the next logical step? They become bankers, and they start transferring money. And you might have known that. Some of you are shaking your heads, you know about this. So what happens is the money that has to go to Jerusalem from Europe, it's in the dangerous route, they send money through the Templar office. The Templars grant them a piece of paper. They take it to the Holy Land and they can cash it in for money. It's a lot safer than taking money. So that's your first MasterCard, is the Knights Templar. And there it was. And so they've become powerful now. In fact, so powerful that the King of France what, say it again? Yeah?
Didn't like it.
Yeah, absolutely. The King of France doesn't like this too much, do they? Can everybody hear my voice up in the back? So the King of France is not happy. He's had a series of wars. He's had enough wars that he owes the Templars a substantial amount of money. All right? And you understand, so you set the stage for the King of France not being happy with the Templars. Meanwhile, the Pope is still helping the Templars considerably. The Pope grants them the right to wear what's called the cross patei. It's the red cross, and that distinguished them from other orders. The Knights of Lazarus wore the green. The Hospitallers, similar symbol, but it was white. All right, and it was, the Hospitallers often put it on a black background. The Templars put this on a white background. So there you have it. And they were established. They were doing well. But something bad happened, and that was, there was a series. How many of you watched some of the movies about the Templars, most specifically where they lost huge battles at Hattin? Are you familiar? Where the Knights, the leaders of Jerusalem started making some bad decisions, and they started leading the Knights into the desert at Hattin, a place where there was a place of water in the desert, but the Saracens were able to poison the well so that they had no access to the drinking water. And there in Hattin, the Knights were tired. They had marched out to the desert. They had pursued the Saracens, And fortunately, they met their death. Most of them met their death there in the desert. And there wasn't a whole lot left to guard Jerusalem. And this was the worst loss. This is the greatest defeat for the Templars. They are obviously weak. They've been marching for days. They have no water now. The well is poisoned. And how many of you know Saladin? Have you heard of Saladin? Saladin pulled this off. He was an expert military leader. He was able to create this whole scenario. And the mistake, of course, was that if they had stayed back behind their fortifications, they would have been safe and they would have had plenty of food and resources. And obviously it takes a much greater army to siege a fortress than it does to beat an army in the field. You all know this. The walls of Jerusalem were quite strong, and they could have protected them if they had only stayed back, right? So they lost a terrible battle there. Ridley Scott's movie. Have you seen Ridley Scott's movie? Yes, you've saw it. Okay. He did a movie about this. Kingdom of Jerusalem is the name of it. And so you saw the Templars lose it. And I caution you on some of the movies, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, is that you'll see a little bit of license historically. You know, some of the characters they positioned as Templars weren't actually Templars. Guy de Lucian, the one that was the evil character in the movie, he wasn't a Templar. He was a leader in Jerusalem, but not a Templar. So he made the Templar, in the movie made the Templars look a little bit bad, right? But you understand the historical story is a little different than the movie itself, right? So now we have the great loss. Jerusalem is lost. Saladin takes Jerusalem. We're around about the end. We're around about 1280. The Acre's still there. They try to save Acre. They lose Acre to Saladin. Saladin's wiping up. He's doing a great job. So now the Templars are routed. Acre was the last great stronghold that they had, and they tried to hold it, but it was just too much. At that time, Saladin had pulled off quite a feat by uniting Egypt and Syria and creating a unity of the Saracens. And he did this before this happened, mind you. There was always a balance of power between Egypt, Syria, and they were able to play one off the other. The Templars were able to be friends with Egypt and then friends with Syria, and then vice versa. So they were able to always stay alive, and even though their numbers were so small, because they were able to play one off the other. Once Saladin had used his political skills to unite the Arab world around the Templars, the end was nigh. And they didn't last. And that was the end of, after Acre, there was 30 more years of mopping up to do. There was a few islands here and there off the coast of Acre where the Templars remained, but they were soon booted off the extra territory. Where did that put the Templars? Well, it put the Templars back in Europe, mostly back in southern France, but also in other countries as well. And so what did that do to the King of France? Well, all the territory that the Templars owned and all the castles, that means money and revenue he doesn't have, and that means land that he doesn't have. Now, he pulled up the King of France just before he took action against the Templars. He did wipe out other merchants and things like this that also owned considerable land. Unfortunately, there's a sad story where he moved against other ethnic groups, and he put them out of power and out of position, and he took their land from them, and the Templars were next on their list. And that's what he did. In 1307, you guys are familiar with the story probably, some of you are, he moved against the Templars. He surprised Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars, by inviting him and all the officers of the Templars to a wedding and Jacques was related to one of the people getting married. So he came with all his entourage, and guess what? The next day he arrested them, and he arrested all the Templars he could get his hands on. Now, that wasn't all the Templars in France, but it was a significant amount, but only in France at that time. Now, there was one more thing that's it's King Philip IV, called La Belle, which means the handsome. All right, and he had one more thing on his side. And does anybody know what that was, considering the Pope and where the Pope was located at that time? Does anybody know where was the Pope located? In France. The Pope was under the thumb of the King of France. He was in Avignon. They was not in Italy at that time. So now he had a bigger problem, and the Pope before him had been killed. by the King of France, and there's some debate and historical confusion about how the previous pope had died. But this pope, Clement V, he was well aware that his predecessor had been killed, and it had been related to the King of France, and he was living in Avignon, right in France, and he wasn't going to mess with, he tried his best. Now, to give the Pope credit, he did some things that helped the Templars along the way. He immediately decreed that the Templars were going to be tried in a church council and a church court, and that removed the ability for Philip to try all of the rest of the Templars in his own government court, because he wanted the Templars to be put to death. They would have met a much greater feat. Some of them were put to death. You all know that in 1314, Jacques de Molay was put to death, and just before Friday the 13th, famously, just before he was put to death, he did recant so they had tortured him so that he confessed false confessions of Templar sins. But before they put him to death, he said, none of that story is true. We were honorable, we were decent people, we didn't commit these crimes that were made up about us by the King of France. And so he died an honorable man, defending his honor, defending the honor of the Knights Templar. All right, so, and he was put to death with two other of his officers. All right, and so what do we know that happened at that point? Well, the King of France no longer could pursue the Templars in other countries. All right, so this was good for the Templars, because there was two homes for the Templars, one in Scotland and one in Portugal. And why is that? Do we have any Scottish folks here today? Okay, we have a few Scots. And right up here.
French and Scottish.
You've got a dangerous combination right there. All right, so what do we know about Scotland at that time? Robert the Bruce was excommunicated by the Pope. And so if you were familiar with the Masonic teachings, and I don't know everything about the Masonic teachings, but if you are, they believe that there was a number of Templars that escaped to Scotland at that time, and that were able to survive under Robert the Bruce. And there's all the myth and legend that goes along with that. They, at the Battle of Bankirk, help me out, say Bankirk, however you say that, is they found one of the leaders, a Templar. Thank you. That's the way he said it. They found the Templar cross on one of the leaders, and the legend goes on from there. They say Robert the Bruce himself may have been a Templar, and there's all kinds of mystery and legend. You're familiar with Roslyn. Has anyone been to Roslyn? Okay, I've been to Roslyn. It was amazing, and there's a lot of history and legend involved in Roslyn. You can watch it on YouTube if you like. And obviously Roslyn, some of the ones believe that Roslyn was a evidence of the Templar existence and continuance in Scotland. So there you have it. Scotland was a safe place for Templars to go, and we do believe some Templars went to Roslyn. However, Portugal is the other safe place for Templars to go. Portugal is a place, obviously behind my theory of Dighton Rock and the theory of Dr. Silva, who some of you are familiar with. And so let's talk about Portugal. And so what happened is that Portugal had King Denis. King Denis was friendly towards the Templars, and he decided to help. So you understand that as soon as the Templars were arrested in 1307, the same year that they were arrested, Clement V, that was the Pope at the time, died. It was only several months later after that happened. I apologize. I said that in the wrong order. It was the same year as Jacques de Molay was put to death in 1314 is when Clement V died. The Pope died. So they delayed for several months appointing a new pope. That was put off. Eventually the next pope was named John, and when he came in, King Denis of Portugal petitioned John and said, I want the Templars to be put and saved because we need them in defending Portugal. They're vital. They've helped us. They've taken a lot of the land back from the Saracens, and we need them in Portugal. Help me out. The new Pope, John, was still in Avignon, but he was less inclined to be worried about King Philip IV. Why is that? Why was he not worried about King Philip IV? Does anyone know? It's the bonus question of the day. King Philip IV died that same period of time, about 9 months after he put Jacques de Molay to death. Obviously, there's a legend behind it. I don't know if it's true. Some of the legend says when Jacques de Molay was being burned at the stake, he said to Clement V and to Philip IV, "You both will die before this year is over." And they both were dead before the year was over. And first Clement V, and then soon after, King Philip IV died. So Pope John wasn't scared of the king anymore of France. It was a different king now, and so he had a bit more freedom. He granted King Denis of Portugal, and that's spelled D-I-N-I-S. So if I'm saying that a little bit wrong, I apologize. But he granted King Denis the right to almost do everything he wanted to do, save one thing. He transferred all of the Templar castles into the just newly created Knights of Christ. He basically, obviously transferred almost the same symbol, the red cross, and you can see the difference. And you know the Knights of Christ is almost the same symbol. He transferred all the lands and property. He transferred everything they owned, all of their land, everything. Save one. The one condition was that the actual Templars shouldn't be put into the order. Now, we have historical records to show that King Denis was able to get around that. There's a lot of distance between Portugal and Avignon, where the Pope was at that time. And we do have records that the Templars were, of course, put into the order. It was their castles, it was their property, everything was the Templars. And so the Templars did end up just transferring in to the Knights of Christ and continuing in Portugal. And so if you guys have been to Portugal, you've seen the beautiful illustration of the Templar castle at Tomar and the Knights of Christ when they took it over, all right, in 1347, they built inside of the convent of Christ, right inside of the Templar castle. So you can see how symbolically the Templar castle became the Knights of Christ castle, and it all melded together. It was essentially the same Templars in the Knights of Christ, and they continued in this way. So let's back up a little bit in Portugal, because this is where our connection is to Miguel Corte Real. And if somebody could help me with the pronunciation so you say that correctly, is it Miguel Corte Real, or how do you say it the exact way? De Real, thank you. Miguel Corte Real, I appreciate that. So now we come to the Dighton Rock Museum. 1511, according to Dr. Silva's theory, is when Miguel Corte Real came here and marked the rock. At 1511, his name, Corte Real, and also, of course, the 1, 2, 3, 4 Knights of Christ crosses. Because we know this, both Miguel and his brother were Knights of Christ. Now, you understand the history of the Portugal and the Knights of Christ and the Templars is so rich that I call Portugal the Templar Kingdom. And why do I call it that? We go right back to the beginning. All right, let's go back to Hugh de Paynes, the first Templar Grand Master. What did Hugh de Paynes do? All right, he sent in the Templars were created 1118. 6 years later, only 6 years later after they were created, he sent 4 of his best Templars to Portugal to help with the Reconquista. The 4 of his best men went to Portugal. They were senior officers. They went and established preceptories. Preceptories are organizations where they recruited Templars, and they became a force in Portugal. From 4 men, they created many, and the Templar order thrived in Portugal. All right, and that was in 1125. So what do we know that happened around that time? We know that Alfonso I, he was called Alfonso the Conqueror, one of the greatest kings in Portuguese history. He was 8 years old when he became knighted. He was 16 when he became king, right? He became king in 1127. So when 1125, when the Templars came and they started establishing preceptories, they befriended the king, Alfonso I the Conqueror, and they started protecting him. So they took a protective role over Alfonso I, and we know this from history and from the records. There's a lot of writing about how the Templars protected and almost in a way were tutored the king, Alfonso I the Conqueror. So they helped him. He was very thankful to the Templars. Portuguese members here, what did they do in return? How much of Portugal did he give to the Knights Templar? Does anyone know? All right, he gave 1/3 of Portugal land he granted to the Templars. Now, understand that was before he conquered Lisbon, and that was a lot smaller. It was just the north, right? So 1/3 of a smaller portion. But that's significant. If you took and gave 1/3 of your personal property to anybody, that would probably be a family member or a very close relative, right? That's a lot to give, and the king had a lot to give. So the Templars were obviously in his good graces, obviously, at that time. So the Templars gathered 1/3 of the property, castles, and resources. They were able to do very well. And we bring in soon thereafter the Order of Aviz, A-V-I-Z, represented by the green color in the Portuguese flag. If you know the flag of Portugal, you have the red and you have the green. The Templars and the Aviz together created Portugal, right? All right, so, and we carry on. Alfonso I, what was his greatest accomplishment as King of Portugal? Does anybody know that studied the history? What did he do? What great city did he conquer that's very significant to Portugal today? Lisbon. He conquered Lisbon. Very good. In 1147, what happened? And is that the first crusade was done and over, but the second crusade started, right? The English Templars and some of the Scottish came down on boats, and they stopped on the shores near Porto. When they got off at Porto, Alfonso I, he was a great talker. He said, guys, look, I know you're headed to the Holy Land. I know you've got to get on, and I know you've got a timeline. But look, if you help me take Lisbon, I will give you. He signed a decree. He's going to give them spoils. He's going to give them riches. He's going to give them position. He's going to give them title. And so what would you have done? You just got there and you got offered a great deal. Lisbon was a rich city. They said, well, heck with the Second Crusade. We're going to take Lisbon. And that's what they did. You can go back in history and read the awesome account of how the Second Crusade, mostly Scottish and English soldiers, but some other country soldiers mixed in, like some French, they sacked Lisbon. They took it. It was Alfonso I, the Conqueror's greatest victory, and it plowed the path ahead for him to take the rest of Portugal. Some argue that if the Second Crusade hadn't ended up in Portugal, and if the Templars hadn't agreed to sack Lisbon, some argue Portugal may not have ever conquered the rest of the south of Portugal. Who knows? But anyways, this is how the history went. And it was a great success for Alfonso, and he was hailed as a conqueror, and he was a conqueror, and he was both militarily, but most importantly, he was great at talking, right? He was a very good salesman. So thank God for his political skills, that he was able to pull off what he did. So that brings us down the road from Alfonso I, and you can go, let's turn to your chronology for those that have it. For those that don't, as she said, you can take a picture or you can send me an email and we'll get you a chronology. Set this down. All right, great. Turn to the chronology. Thank you very much. And everybody can still hear me in the back? All right, good, excellent. So we talked about some of the chronology already. All right, we got to King Dinas dies. All right, let's go there. And you see here 1320 Prince Pedro is born. And what happens is once there was a traumatic event that came, all right? And this was before Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator is probably the most famous Knight of Christ. And you guys know Henry the Navigator because we even teach him in U.S. history, right? All right. He was the greatest Knight of Christ Grandmaster who started great navigation across the ocean, and very likely Henry the Navigator's push for navigation and ships and sailing across and discovery led to Miguel Corte Real, trip along the coast of Massachusetts. So, and obviously it led to Magellan. You see inside of the other ship in here is Magellan's ship, obviously inside of the museum. And so the history was made when Henry the Navigator became one of the most famous and most sea-friendly, navigation-friendly grandmasters. He transferred and transformed the Knights of Christ from a land-based army to a naval force. And why is that? Because the great discoveries and the great explorations were at sea, were from far distances. And the next places they could conquer had to be distances away. So he was one of the greatest transformational figures for that organization. And so we talk about for a second, one of the Portuguese kings was passed away without an heir. And what happened was John I was the illegitimate son of King Pedro. You see King Pedro referenced in your chronology. Pedro I had an illegitimate son. And what happened to that illegitimate son? When he was young, he was assigned to be protected by the Templars. Do we see the circulation of history? History goes back in a circle, doesn't it? Because we go back to Alfonso I. As an 8-year-old child and as a 16-year-old child, he was assigned to the Templars to be protected. So the same way John I was of Portugal. John I grew up, was tutored by the Templars, protected by the Templars, and he owed a lot to the Templars. He was grateful. When he was only a young man, he was appointed to be the Grand Master of the other great order, represented by the green color, which is Aviz. Again, the other great order. So he was both, legacy of the Templars and legacy of Aviz. So he was, as the Grand Master of Aviz, when there was no heir for the King of Portugal, we had a crisis. And what happened? Well, the King of Castile, who always had a lot of influence at that time over Portugal, he was also named John. He wanted to take Portugal and incorporate it into Castile, which is the biggest shareholder in Spain at that time. He owned the most of Spain, and he, obviously Castile, as you know from history, went on to become the greatest province of Spain and to do the most conquering. But he also wanted to conquer Portugal. And they had tried several times, and you were familiar with the Portuguese history, they were always fighting off Castile. They were always fighting off Spain. All right, so what happened? The two Johns clashed. But thank God for John I of Portugal, because he had now the protection of the Templars, and he was the Grand Master of Aviz. He had both orders of Portugal representing him. And against much greater odds, a much bigger army from John of Castile besieged them. But guess what? John I of Portugal won, and the bastard son of King Pedro I defeated the King of Castile. And what does the bastard son of Portugal remind you of from modern day TV? Does anybody care? You watch the TV series on HBO? Where Jon Snow, John I of Portugal was the modern day Jon Snow, wasn't he? He was the bastard son as well. But the people loved him, and the people, just the same in the way as they loved Jon Snow, they loved John I of Portugal, and they put him in power, and everybody lined up behind him, and he found a way to create an equilibrium for all classes of Portugal, and that was his greatest victory. Once he did that, he continued the Reconquista, and he continued down southern, and just finished off what Alfonso I the Conqueror had started. He continued and he completed the rest. And he was a great king. He was an amazing king. And I'm convinced part of the reason that he was a great king was because of his upbringing, because he wasn't royal treated special, and because he was used to being the bastard. He was used to being treated badly by some. He was used to be considered an ill light for being an illegitimate child, but he went on to greatness, and he was rewarded, and he was disciplined, and he was very good at his job, and he did great for Portugal. So you can go on, and you can help yourself to more of the chronology. I don't want to belabor the points. You can see the rest that occurred, and we lead on. We'll read a little bit. The 1400s. Let's read a little bit about Henry the Navigator. He was from Sagres, and I say that a little bit wrong. But then he also was in the area of the Convent of Christ in Tomar, and this was the Portuguese start of discoveries. All right, and from there we have the greatest chapter in Portuguese history, where they played a huge role with Magellan and the rest of them. They had, there are some say that Columbus himself, all right, obviously you know the theory. Some say Columbus himself, had some Portuguese roots, or was, married a Portuguese, Right, and to this day, on the sails of Columbus's ships, what do they say was on the sails? The cross of the Knights of Christ of Portugal. So you can see, I hope, from this discussion, the way the Templars evolved right into the Knights of Christ, how it was really the same order that continued despite the best efforts of King Philip IV. Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Despite his best efforts to destroy the order, it didn't work. And to this day, we can point to the Knights of Christ as the continuation of the Templars. Today, there's two branches of the Knights of Christ. There's one appointed by the Vatican. You can be appointed by the Pope as a Knight of Christ, and there's one branch appointed by the government of Portugal. If you do great deeds and you do awesome job at maybe a great politician or something, or a great business manager, you could be rewarded by the government of Portugal by being appointed to the Knights of Christ. So it still exists today. It exists in those two branches. And there is still on both branches, both the Catholic Church side and on the other side, there is Knights of Christ that last today. So did the Templars really ever go away? I don't think so. I think that between Scotland and Portugal and the other possibilities, I think that they may have continued. And that's not to say we're not talking about a direct lineage. We're not talking about sons and daughters. We're talking about the philosophy, the theory, and the transformation of the Templars into the Knights of Christ. And that's where we say the continuation of the Templars, because the Knights of Christ were essentially the Templars, and they did the same thing. And so I think, obviously, I'm biased. I think Dr. Silva's theories are correct. That talk is for another time. You can go on YouTube and you can watch, if you type into YouTube, Dr. Manuel Silva, Dighton Rock. You can watch his awesome addresses. He talks about how his theory and why he believes what he does. He was a smart man. He was a doctor. So you can hear from him, a better source than me, why he believes this rock was signed by our Miguel Corte Real. So any questions at all on any part of this talk, or on John's section in the beginning? You understand that what John was talking about, and I appreciate his explaining. There are several modern day groups of Templars, and we don't claim any descendancy from the original Templars. We are clear that we started in we didn't continue from 1307 when the Templars were arrested. We are purely a modern day group of Templars. We do have a history from 1705. That's 300 years. That's a long time. The Masons do too. They go back to 17 something. And so the Masons back to Scotland, Lodge number 1, the Masonic Templars have a long history as well. And that's like, I think, some of you may know the exact date. I think it's like 1730 something. The Masonic Templars started Lodge number 1 in Scotland. All right, so what does that mean? Well, the Masonic Templars, some of them believe that they descended directly from the original Templars, and some of them don't. You'll get both sides. It's probably pretty close to 50-50 of the views among the Templar Masons. Great group of people. They do a lot of good stuff. I don't happen to be a Masonic Templar. I can't talk for them. So, yes, John?
I believe we have one here. Is that
yeah.
true?
Yeah. Wonderful. Do you know the date for Scotland Lodge number 1?
1733.
Thank you, sir. 1733. So, and are you one of the ones that believe they descended from the Templars or didn't descend from the Templars?
Descended.
Fantastic. I think it's like 50-50. Would you say it's about right? Half believe the descendants and half don't? Great. It's a great organization. It's a great group of people with a great long history. Myself, there is a small group of our organization that believes they're descended, but not much. I take a very realistic view that we started in 1705, and that's pretty good for me. 300 years is enough. I'm happy with that. And so what do we do today? Well, there's several of groups like us connected in different ways. The largest in the United States is 5,000 members. It's called the SMOTJ at smotj.org, and they raise money for philanthropic causes. They do great works. They support. They're part of they're chartered in the United Nations charity organizations. So they play a role worldwide. They are in at last count 44 countries. We're a little bit smaller. We're 3,000. We are in 36 countries. We have obviously our most important figure is my Templar father, Luis Matos, the Grand Prior of Portugal, and how I got my start as a Templar. And I consider him our most important, as some of you will share that view. But so we do similar things. We're located at osmtj.net. If you want to find us online, you can find it on the business card if you've taken the card, or you can find the United States chapter at theknightstemplar.org. The knightstemplar.org is our United States chapter. We do philanthropic causes as well. We run charity events, especially around the holidays, blanket drives. We do food drives. This October we're headed to West Virginia. We're doing a charity event for the children and children's home in West Virginia. If you want more details, you can just ask us later. We can give you more details. But that's what we do today. The Masons do similar stuff. The Masonic Templars, as our friend here can tell you, they raise money for all kinds of things. In fact, the Templars in this area are for the eye hospital. Am I right?
We're in hospital.
Shriners. The Shriners, they raise money for the burn victims, and there's several other causes they raise money for. That's what Templars do today. No more wars to fight. Our only battle is through words, if anything, and we push for the protection of children and the needy, and still that cause is continued. As the ancient Templars originally protected pilgrims on the road from danger, we say the modern day Templars still protects pilgrims on the road. And the road is anyone that's in need, that's needy, that's on their way in life where they may be going. Our job is to help, and that's what we do. Let me open up to answers and questions time if anyone has any.
What's the connection between the Templars and the Holy Grail?
Oh, you're going to see a show called Nightfall, and that's a great question. So if you guys watch the History Channel, I think it's History 2. If I'm wrong, tell me. But it's coming in just like maybe 1 month or maybe 2. It's going to be Nightfall. That's spelled with a K. It's going to be a great series, and it talks about just what you asked, the Holy Grail. What is it for me first? The Holy Grail for me is, obviously, in the Last Supper, the cup that Jesus drank out of, and there's many that believe the Holy Grail, that cup that Jesus drank out of, still exists. There's one in a museum in Italy. There's one in a museum in Spain. There's probably one in America somewhere. There's several belief systems. I don't believe that this still exists today. I believe the Holy Grail is a concept. I think of it like this. A Grail Knight is one who works toward what the Grail stood for. And what the Grail stood for is that compassion and that Jesus showed, right? And when Jesus took that drink from the Holy Grail, right? What he was doing, he was sacrificing himself, and he was eating his Last Supper. We have to sacrifice ourselves as whatever organization we're in, as Templars, as Masons. We have to make sacrifices in our daily lives. That's the Grail life. We call it as a Grail Knight. And we talk about that in our order. We talk about being a Grail Knight and what that means. People have written books on it. There's a book called The Grail Knight, and that's what it means to me. So there is some that believe that there's a Holy Grail, and I don't make fun of them. I say, God bless you, go for it. Have you met some that believe that Holy Grail exists? Okay, there are some that believe it, but for me, it's a concept, it's a philosophy, and it's a way of life. I like to reference the saying from our current regent, Dr. Hamavici of France. He said, being a Knight Templar isn't a way of the past, it is a way of life. And that's what it boils down to. The second thing he said after that is, you're not a Knight Templar in your heart until your heart is changed to become a Knight Templar. And might sound like circular reasoning, but you're not a Knight until you become a Knight Templar in your heart. So it's not by wearing fancy badges. It's not by wearing a fancy Knight type of clothing. It's not by wearing pins and crosses and swords and whatever we might wear. It's by being transformed in your heart so that you have the compassion and the desire to help others. That's when you become a Knight Templar, and that's my belief. That was a good question, by the way. What do you personally believe about the Holy Grail?
I kind of like the ending of the Da Vinci Code.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
I think it's top notch.
Yeah, if you get to Italy, you can visit. You can Google that later if you like. There's a Grail on display. Yeah, it's fancy. I don't know how Jesus could have afforded that glass. It's covered in gold. I don't know how it's possible.
It was a wooden.
Yeah, I would have thought it'd be a wooden cup, right? No, not the one on display. It's, oh yeah. It was like, hey, you know, Judas had it, I guess. I don't know. Wow. What other questions might we have? Okay, let's go to hers and then yours. Yeah, the hook decks. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was there the day you guys might have been there the day across the way down in Rhode Island when they had the Narragansett runestone. Were you there? Oh, okay. You've seen it on TV. Great. All right. And so what do we see there? We see the hooked X on the Narragansett runestone. This is what I call the triangle of Templarism in America. Why is it the triangle? Is because you got the Narragansett runestone, you got what I call the Templar Tower, which others call the Newport Tower, and you obviously have the famous Dighton Rock, right? And not only that, if you go a little outside of the triangle, you have in northern Massachusetts, you have etched, right? Have you been there? Yeah. Yeah, Westford. It's called the Westford Knight, exactly. Yeah. So what do you have? You have the Templar Tower, the Westford Knight, the Dighton Rock, and now you've got the Narragansett runestone. That's pretty great. That creates a lot of history right here, and I love it. And that's what I love. So when that was dedicated, I went down to the Narragansett runestone dedication and saw the hooked axe. I heard the forensic scientist talk about it, and I heard his argument. You can watch it on YouTube. Scott Walter. Is anyone familiar with Scott Walter? Hey, there you go. All right. I know Scott Walter's a great guy. I don't know him well. I've seen him 3 times. There we go.
Apparently he came here for a visit.
He did? Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, John knows him better than me because John made an awesome plaque for him. It was the Templar symbol, and at the Narragansett runestone dedication, John gave him the plaque and Scott Walter loved it. Yeah. He thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, so Brody as well.
Yeah. If you know David Brody, he almost came today. One of our good friends. He writes a lot of Templar-based books. We love David Brody, local guy. He did sort of a movie about the Templar Tower, so Scott Walter has some great theories. Do I believe all the theories of Scott Walter? No, not necessarily, but you know what? It might be true. I'm not an expert. He's more of an expert than me. But here's what I like. I like that Scott Walter looks into it, and I like that he presents it, and I like that it brings up interest in the topic, right? He's doing us a great favor. I'm not going to knock him. In some of his theories are probably right. Nobody's 100% right. So that's my view on Scott Walter. I can't endorse him, but hey, I like what he's doing for the cause, right? And if he draws interest to the Templars and the Masonic Templars and our Templars, if he draws interest like Ridley Scott's movie, all the power to him, all right? That's great. So you can watch the theories. This is a great follow-up. If you go to YouTube and type in Scott Walter, Newport Tower, you're going to see awesome episode on the Newport Tower, and it was from History Channel 2. And it was a great episode. It's really fascinating. I don't know if he did one on the Dighton Rock. Do you know?
I heard him mention it, but I never saw it.
Mentioned it? Okay, he mentioned the Dighton Rock. Okay. Brief. Okay, that's fine. But he definitely did the Westford Knight. He talked about the Westford Knight. And you guys know that the museum in Salem, New Hampshire has also the etching of the Westford Knight on it. It has like to protect it in perpetuity. But the Westford Knight is great. It's interesting, that punch hole design. It's a must-see place if on your trips among the Templar Triangle, as I call it. All right, so I love this area, and I'm glad I live here. What other questions? So you are the next one.
Yeah, I was curious are there any Templars in the Western Christian tradition? Because you were there at the Crusades, so we had the Orthodox, like the Western Byzantine Church, I guess. Did you guys ever
Interesting story. You know what caused the Templar explosion? Is that the Orthodox were the main force in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem until the 1840s. And you know what happened? If you're familiar with the sites in Jerusalem, some of you may have been there. If you go to the Holy Sepulchre today, it's split up between the Catholics and the Orthodox. But until the 1840s, the Orthodox played a much heavier role. And at that time, you could go to the Orthodox site of the Holy Sepulchre, and you could pay what would equivalent today about $50, and you could be knighted into what they called the Order of the Holy Sepulchre. Now that still exists today as a Catholic order, but in the 1840s, the Catholic Church took a bigger role in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they sent a letter out to all the members of the Order of the Holy Sepulchre, and they said, if you have been knighted into the Orthodox or as a Protestant, you must convert to Catholicism, or you will have to give up your rights as a member. So what that created in some countries, in Belgium specifically, is a whole lot of Protestants and some Orthodox in that area that didn't want to convert to become a Catholic. And what they did, what was their solution, was to have a Templar explosion. So that the Holy Sepulchre and that order is what caused our order to explode today. And starting in Belgium, it was sort of our birth, our sort of our rebirth place, if you will. And that was in the 1840s. So all of these, members of the knighthood of the Holy Sepulchre suddenly became Templars, because they could become Templars as an Orthodox or as a Protestant, and of course as a Catholic. Still today, 50% of our members are Catholic, but that means 50% of our members are Orthodox and Protestant. Our next Grand Master will be an Orthodox. He practices the Georgian branch of Orthodox religion, and so he practices that, and he will be an Orthodox. So that's interesting. And so there are definitely Orthodox Templars. We have an active group in Georgia and countries like that are Orthodox, and they very much are into the Templars, and they do all kinds of events and things like that. And so it's really fascinating. Our next leader, Grand Master, is going to be General Ronald Mangum, and he is an Orthodox Christian. So great question. And so yes, the answer is there's a lot of Orthodox that become Templars today. And it's quite amazing. That's why one thing I like about the Templar world, both the Masonic Templars and the non-Masonic Templars, is that Catholics are lucky. And I don't take anything from them. I'm a Catholic. Catholics are lucky. We have the Order of Malta. Now we have the Order of the Holy Sepulchre all to ourselves. We have the Knights of Columbus. We have most of the orders. Protestants have the Order of St. John, but the Order of St. John is really exclusive. If you've ever tried to get in, it costs a lot of money. All right, but so what does the Templars do? It allows Protestants and Orthodox to have a place to go. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that. We try to be a mixing pot. We try to always have a united focus of bringing Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants together into one group. And so we focus on what unites us, and that's one thing we do. And we can do that only in America. Imagine if we tried to do that in some parts of Ireland. It wouldn't work as well, would it? No. But thank God for America and what it stands for, because we can be a melting pot of those things.